Welcome back to the Ladakh Literature Festival of 2020. Our session for today is Wild Himalaya, a lecture by Stephen Auter. Stephen Auter talks about his book, Wild Himalaya, one of the definitive guides to the natural history of the greatest mountain ranges on Earth. His most recent work of fiction, In Jungles of the Night, a novel about Jim Corbett, was shortlisted for the DSC South Asian Literature Award in 2017. He is founding director of the Mussoorie Mountain Festival. Thank you for that session. Do stay tuned for more such exciting sessions.
Greetings from Mussoorie. It's a real pleasure to be here at the Ladakh Literature Festival. I visited Ladakh on a number of occasions. I wish I could be there in person, but given the circumstances now, being part of a virtual presentation is also a great privilege, honor, and delight. Today I'm going to be talking about my book, Wild Himalaya, A Natural History of the Greatest Mountain Range on Earth. This is a book that I've been working on for a number of years. Perhaps the last 5 years at least were spent in sort of concentrated travel, research, and writing of the book. But in a sense, it's a book that I've been writing all my life as I've traveled to different parts of the Himalaya and observed different species, different landscapes, different climates throughout this mountain range. In a sense, Wild Himalaya is an attempt to tell the life story of these mountains. It's a biography in a sense, but it's not just one biography, it's biography of a number of different species that inhabit these mountains, including our own. I try to tell the story of the geology of the mountains, the hydrology, the climate, the plant life, the birds and mammals that are found throughout this mountain range. And I also try to weave together with those stories our human story, the way in which we as human beings interact with other species and cohabit these mountains, which are so diverse and have so many different altitudinal zones, so many different kinds of forest cover, so many different habitats that we ourselves occupy and in many cases share with other species. Now, when we think of the Himalaya, we usually think of them in terms of the highest peaks, the summits of great mountains like Dhaulagiri, which we see here in this photograph above Muktinath. We often think of these mountains as being eternal, unchanging, immutable in that sense. But I think one of the truths about the Himalaya that I learned over the course of my writing and research was that, in fact, these mountains are constantly changing. There is something that is always in flux in this mountain range. And it starts, of course, with the geology. The fact that we know the tectonic plates collided and these mountains are pushing up. Even today, they are rising an infinitesimal amount every day. When we look at the ice and the snow that covers these mountains, it appears to be static, but in fact, that ice is flowing. We are unable to watch those rivers of ice moving, but in fact, they are moving imperceptibly every day. And then there are so many other aspects of the mountains that are changing, whether it's the creatures that migrate from one area of the mountains to the other, or people who migrate and move through different altitudinal zones according to the seasons. There is change that is cyclical, there is change that is progressive. Undeniably, these mountains offer us also an inspiration that goes beyond the world that we can easily observe. Just as this photograph of Mount Everest at dawn with the sun rising up over the South Pole suggests, in a sense, that moment of creation. The eye of creation, in a sense, is there. And for a naturalist, that sense of creation really comes down to some of the very basic elements of nature. The elements of sunlight, the elements of air, the elements of the soil, and of course, water. Each of these elements combine to allow the Himalaya to become a living landscape. And I think as we look at those high mountains, we're looking at a very desolate, barren, frozen part of the mountains. But we must also understand that the Himalaya contain much more than that. In fact, the vast majority of land that the Himalaya occupy is a living landscape of forests, meadows, different species of ferns, mosses, trees, plants, and the creatures that depend on each of those plant species. Here in Ladakh, it's very, very evident where the water flows and brings life to the land. In this picture in the Zaskar Valley, you can see where someone has channeled the water through a very dry and arid landscape and then brought life to the land by planting crops, by planting trees, and you get this wonderful vivid green splash of color amidst the tawny brown landscape that surrounds it. Water is perhaps the most essential element in the Himalaya, and we often speak of the Himalaya as being the water towers of Asia because the Himalaya are a vast reservoir of moisture that collects particularly during the monsoon and then is held and released slowly by the glaciers, by the snowpack, through the aquifer, as well as it drains out into streams, rivers, into water bodies at different locations in the Himalaya. The ice, of course, is a fragile and expendable resource. If we look at the Raikot Glacier here, we can see where the snout of the glacier extends partway down the valley. The river finds its source at the snout. It continues down. But we can see how that glacier has receded on either side, and you can see the moraine there. We can also see the way in which the trees and other plants have moved in where the glacier has receded, and they have taken root and draw sustenance from the water that comes out of that glacier. When we search for the source of a river, it should seem to be a very obvious and easy quest, but in fact, there is a great deal of uncertainty in that as to where that river begins. We might say it begins at the snout of the glacier, but then as we climb that glacier and ascend over that river of ice, we realize that that source lies further up. And then ultimately, as we look up at a mountain like Nanga Parbat, we see that the water, the moisture, flows right from the summit of that peak. And then beyond the summit is the cloud cover. And that, in a sense, is the true source of any river or stream in the Himalaya, because those clouds release their moisture onto the slopes and then it flows down. And particularly, this is true during the monsoon period. The Himalaya have a very important role to play in the creation of the monsoon through the warming of the land, the way in which it draws moisture right across the Indian subcontinent up into the mountains. And then as a barrier, they stop the clouds, and then the clouds ultimately release their moisture onto these mountains. So that relationship between the monsoon and the Himalaya is a very vital part of nature and the forces of nature that bring life to these mountains. Now, some of the most evident forms of life at the highest elevations are the plants, the mosses, the lichens, the small stub-like plants that grow right up near the snow line. And then as you start descending, you have wonderful, vivid colored species like this blue poppy that grows well above the tree line and is found in parts of the Tibetan Plateau on either side of the Himalayan range. There are many species that exist well above the altitudinal zone that we sometimes think of as the tree line or the temperate forests that are found lower down. The Brahmkamal, Sauceria oblivata, is one example of this. It's a wonderful plant considered sacred in many parts of the Himalaya, and it comes to life at a particular time of the spring and early summer with the monsoon, and then we find it throughout the monsoon period ending in about the end of August or early September. This plant is not growing alone, however, and that is one of the important things to recall about the Himalaya, and that no species exists on its own. And if you look in a field of Brahmkamal, they may be the most prominent flower, but in fact all around it there is sedum. There are so many different other species that are growing in concert with that plant. Those plants, whether it's flowers like the rhododendron flower or the calyx of the birch trees and so many other flowering species, they attract, of course, other forms of life like insects. And those insects then feed upon those plants and as a result then attract a whole different range of birds that depend on them and other creatures that feed off of those particular insects. So it becomes this chain, a food chain certainly, but also a chain of relationships that we find in the Himalaya. These green pigeons, or wedge-tailed green pigeons, actually inhabit forests much lower down at about 2,000 meters, where you have dense forest cover. And you can see how their beautiful plumage blends in with the green shadows of the trees. I spoke earlier about the way in which species migrate throughout the Himalaya. These black-necked cranes are a wonderful example of this. They spend their summer months, they breed in places like Ladakh and in the Tibetan Plateau. And then as winter arrives, they move across the mountain chain to somewhat lower elevations like the Pokjika Valley in Bhutan. And it's still quite high, it's still extremely cold in winter, but there is more for them to feed on. And this migration, as I said earlier, is so much a part of that constantly moving puzzle of life that the Himalayas contain. The mammals, the wildlife that we find in the mountains is equally diverse. Here is a photograph of a ghural that I surprised very close to my home in Mussoorie at the Jabbercake Nature Reserve. The ghural is an interesting animal because it gives us a sense of the evolutionary patterns in the Himalaya. Zoologists tell us that the ancestor of goats and sheep was something like the ghural. It's a goat antelope, not quite a goat, not quite an antelope, and there are these sort of ancestral echoes, at least, in this particular species. Speaking of ancestry, we also find certain species that share ancestry with ourselves. There are a number of primates that inhabit different elevations in the Himalaya. Here we have a golden langur that lives in the Lochur foothills of Bhutan, near the Manas River, a species that we share many traits with, and a species that has a very, very slim area of habitation where it is endemic. The pika is a very small creature that inhabits high elevations of the Himalaya. It is a mouse hare, as some people call it. It lives within the rocks, it burrows into the ground, and it may appear on one level to be an insignificant, mundane species, but in fact it is vital to the environmental health of the Himalaya. It aerates the soil, loosens the earth around the roots of plants. It serves as a prey species for many raptors and other small mammals. In this photograph you can see how it has a nick taken out of its ear, very likely the scar of an encounter with an eagle or a hawk that tried to catch it, and it escaped from there. As human beings, when we look at all of the diversity of life in the Himalaya, it captures our imagination. It makes us want to discover more about the species that we share this space with. And even if we go back in time to the period immediately after the last ice age, close to 10,000 years ago, we will see evidence of human beings recording the stories, the observations they have made about the natural history of the Himalaya. Here in Ladakh, we have petroglyphs, ancient petroglyphs that date back probably to the Stone Age, when hunters first entered the Himalaya as the ice pack retreated. And they found different species that we can see etched on these rocks. There are bharal, there are ibex, there are deer that they encountered. And seeing these petroglyphs, we have to ask ourselves, what were the hunters trying to tell us? What were they trying to tell each other? Here we have, for instance, a snow leopard that has been carved into the surface of this rock. And it may be that the hunters were telling each other that this is a place where you can find this particular species or other species. But there was probably more to it than that. There was probably something beyond that story. It could be that shamans were recognizing and showing reverence for the different species that they encountered, blessing the hunt on which their own survival depended. And it's interesting to think of the ways in which human beings make a gesture toward those other species, toward the landscape itself, and the way in which they carve those stories onto these rocks. I think human beings have a tendency to leave behind some evidence of their passage in many, many different situations, but particularly in the mountains. When someone has traveled a particular route, particularly when that person has crossed over a high pass where a panorama of peaks were visible, they often leave behind a cairn of stones, piling one stone upon the other, sometimes in a very simple fashion, in other cases in a quite elaborate manner that is a gesture of awe, a gesture of perhaps reverence towards the mountains, and certainly a statement that I was here, I saw these mountains. And these cairns, I often think of them as being a way in which human beings in a sense, reduce the mountains to a scale that we can appreciate and understand. They are a replica of the mountain range that we see beyond us. It's also interesting to think of the way in which those cairns have evolved into more elaborate structures like a temple or a chorten. And those chortens that we find in many parts of the Himalaya, as well as temples that have been erected by people of the Hindu faith, they, in a sense, are a replica of the great mountains that we see. If you look at Mount Kailash, for instance, which is often considered the most sacred peak in the Himalaya, revered both by Buddhists and by Hindus. If you look at the striations on the face of that mountain itself, the chortens, the temples in the mountains and throughout India, in a sense, replicate that shape of the mountain. And in that way, human beings offer a token of their own sense of mystery and awe that they experience when they encounter these mountains. At the end of the day, when we look at a panorama of snow peaks, just as we look at this photograph of Bandarpunch at sunset, which is a view that I see from my home or near my home here in Missouri, there is, of course, first of all, that aesthetic appreciation for the beauty of those mountains. But there is also, I believe, a desire to internalize that vision, to take those mountains into ourselves and to appreciate it not just as an external experience, but also as an internal experience, something that is mystical, something that is powerful, and something that moves us profoundly. Thank you. Thank you very much.